Let us begin. Our first theologian is Richard Rubinstein. Richard Lowell Rubinstein was born on January 8th, 1924 in New York City. He is, to the best of my knowledge, still alive. He was an educator in religion and a writer in the American Jewish community, noted particularly for his contributions to Holocaust theology. Rubinstein began his tertiary education at Hebrew Union College, the Reformed Rabbinical Seminary. Again, I apologize. I don't know the crowd. Normally, of course, when I give this, it's not over Zoom, so I'm able to get to know my audience a little better. Let me briefly define the difference between Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Judaism. Primarily, while there are many differences, the significant difference in terms of our discussion is how do we relate to modernity. Reform, at one end, argues that modernity, advance in civilization, should mold the way we view and observe the tenets of religion. Orthodoxy, on the other side, argues that the morality and the teachings of Judaism, the essence of religion, should mold the times in which we live. And that is the fundamental difference in how they approach everyday life and how they approach certain theological issues. Conservative is in the middle. They're trying to certainly live with and accommodate modernity, and at the same time hold true to tradition. Orthodox does not really care per se to hold on to modernity. They're willing to let modernity suffer in order to adhere to tradition. And Reform is willing to forego certain religious principles in order to accommodate modernity. Many people might disagree with that definition. I understand, but for us, it's a working definition that will allow us to understand better the philosophers we're going to see. Rubinstein began his studies in the Reformed Rabbinical Seminary. He graduated from the University of Cincinnati with a BA degree, and he was awarded a Master's of Hebrew Literature from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, which is the conservative rabbinical school. He studied at Harvard Divinity School and was awarded a Master of Sacred Theology degree. Finally, he pursued doctoral studies and received a PhD from Harvard University in 1960. Rubinstein has 2 honorary doctorates, Doctor of Hebrew Letters from the Jewish Theological Seminary and Doctor of Humane Letters from Grand Valley State University. Richard Rubinstein, he wrote as follows in his book, After Auschwitz. He says, I believe the single greatest challenge, to modern Judaism arises out of the question of God and the death camps. How can Jews believe in an omnipotent, beneficent God after Auschwitz? Now he goes on to explain his question. Traditional Jewish theology maintains that God is the ultimate, omnipotent actor in historical drama. What does that mean? It means that traditionally, if traditional Judaism believes that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and omniscient, all-knowing, it means that he knows all that goes on, and anything that can happen in the world happens with his acquiescence. Nothing can happen without God's agreement and, if you will, involvement in its happening. So he says that Jews believe God is the ultimate omnipotent actor in historical drama. He controls the scenario of drama and history throughout times. And it has been interpreted every major catastrophe in Jewish history as God's punishment of a sinful Israel. What does that mean? It means that if God is beneficent, he is all good, good beings, good gods, good people do not punish the innocent. They don't make the innocent suffer for no reason. Therefore, traditional Judaism has suggested that if one suffers, it's an opportunity to look at oneself and try to discover a failing, a reason why that suffering might have come upon you. For example, the what's called the Musar books, the ethical teaching books say if you stub your toe, take a moment and think, what did I do to deserve this? Maybe I spoke badly of someone. Maybe I inadvertently offended someone. Maybe I've done something that deserves censure. So that works for an individual, and traditionally that works throughout the world, for people. So traditionally, Jewish theology, God is the ultimate omnipotent actor, and it is interpreted every major catastrophe in Jewish history as God's punishment of a sinful Israel. I fail to see how this position can be maintained without regarding Hitler and the SS as instruments of God's will. The agony of European Jewry cannot be likened to the testing of Job. To see any purpose in the death camps, the traditional believer is forced to regard the most demonic, anti-human explosion of all history as a meaningful expression of God's purposes. And Rubinstein is not incorrect in all the points he makes. He says that, in fact, yes, one would have to come to the conclusion that Hitler and the SS are somehow instruments of God's will. They couldn't have functioned without God agreeing that they function. Now, this is not a new problem. Throughout history, whether it's the Inquisition, or whether it's famine, or whether it's cancer, or whether it's disease in general, we believe that these are instruments of God's happening because they couldn't happen otherwise. If God didn't allow it to happen, it couldn't happen. So the question, therefore, one must ask is why? The prime example of that in biblical theology is the book of Job. What is the book of Job? So there's two parts to it. The first part is God is sitting with his angels, looking down at man. And God says to the angels, he says, look at my servant Job. What a guy. What a upright, stand right guy. He loves me. He serves me. He takes my interests into consideration. I love Job. Job is a great example of a servant of God. So the angels listened, and one angel in particular, he has different names in different religions, but let us call him Satan, the Satan, right? Some might call him Lucifer, some might call him the devil. But the Satan said to God, we also believe traditionally in Judaism that Satan is an angel of God. He also cannot function without God's acquiescence. And he said to him, of course, Job is a great servant. You've given him everything. You've given him good health. You've given him a nice family. You've given him wealth. You've given him status. You've given him everything a human being can possibly want. So of course he loves you. But I bet, the Satan said to God, if you took away all the advantages that life has to offer, so he would become embittered, and he would turn on you, and he would resent you, and he would ultimately condemn you for being less than compassionate. So God says, I don't believe it, but I'll let you try. And in fact, the rest of the book is the Satan administering the harshest of punishments to an innocent Job. The harshest punishments, and sit around the table and they try to determine, did Job do to deserve this? And they suggest this and they suggest that, and Job rebuffs this, and he says, no, that's not the case. And in fact, they're unable to determine what it is that Job did, and Job argues and remains convinced that in fact he was totally righteous. At the very end of the book, God reveals to Job that he stood up to the test. He withstood everything that the Satan was throwing at him, and he proved himself to be righteous, and God restored his wealth, his family, his status, etc. Now that's the paradigm example in biblical literature of how bad things might happen to a good person. And that, in fact, it is possible that one could be punished without being guilty of something. So Rubinstein says that can't be here, because Job is an individual. But 6 million people, that's impossible. It's incomprehensible to see any purpose in the death camps. The traditional believer is forced to regard the most demonic, anti-human explosion of all history as a meaningful expression of God's purposes. God wanted this to happen. And he says the idea is simply too obscene for me to accept. I do not think that the full impact of Auschwitz has yet been felt in Jewish theology or Jewish life. Great religious revolutions have their own period of gestation. No man knows when the full impact of Auschwitz will be felt, but no religious community can endure so hideous a wounding without undergoing vast inner disorders. Here he's saying that he is a Reformed rabbi, and therefore his connection with traditional theology is more pliant. He says, but eventually, even the Orthodox, who have an ironclad commitment to tradition, even they are going to be dramatically affected and come to the realization that this is an obscene idea, that there could be any purpose in the Holocaust, any purpose in such torture and mass death. And he says, when that happens, there will be a great religious revolution. So when he says, he concludes, when I say we live in the time of the death of God, I mean that the thread uniting God and man, heaven and earth, has been broken. We stand in a cold, silent, unfeeling cosmos, unaided by any purposeful power beyond our own resources. After Auschwitz, what else can a Jew say about God? Now, Rubinstein is not addressing the issue of does God exist. For the purpose of our argument, let us agree that God does exist. What Rubinstein is saying, our relationship is over. There can be no more relationship. There is no more turning to a God who will save us from tragedy. When someone is sick, there's no purpose in standing by their bedside and praying, because it seems after Auschwitz, he says, that there is nothing, no one, no God listening. The relationship, he says, is over. We're on our own. And that is the tragedy of the Holocaust. We are no longer in connection with God, but we stand alone in a cold, heartless universe. The first theological approach to our relationship with God is, according to Rubinstein, we have no more relationship. The second philosopher, Emil Fackenheim, was a noted Jewish philosopher and Reform rabbi. Born in Halle, Germany. I also want to point out that Rubinstein was born in America. So he's writing from the comforts of America and is shocked by what he's seen, what he learned of the Holocaust. Fackenheim was born in Germany. He had family that died, as we'll see. He was arrested by the Nazis on the 9th of November, 1938, Kristallnacht. Briefly interned at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, he escaped with his younger brother, Wolfgang, to Great Britain, where his parents later joined him. Emil's older brother, Ernst Alexander, refused to leave Germany, was killed in the Holocaust. Held by the British as an enemy alien after the outbreak of World War II, Fackenheim was sent to Canada in 1940, where he was interned in a remote internment camp near Sherbrooke, Quebec. After he was freed, he served as the interim rabbi at Temple Anshe Sholem in Hamilton, Ontario, from 1943 to 1948. He received a PhD in medieval Arabic philosophy from the University of Toronto. In 1945, he was a professor of philosophy at the university. In 1945, he received his degree in medieval Arabic philosophy, and he served as a professor of philosophy from 1948 until 1984 at the University of Toronto. He researched the relationship of the Jews with God, believing that the Holocaust must be understood as an imperative, as we're going to see, requiring Jews to carry on Jewish existence and the survival of the state of Israel. He immigrated to Israel in 1984. Emil Fackenheim. A secularist Jew, he writes, cannot make himself believe by a mere act of will. If you don't believe in God, You can't force yourself, nor can he be commanded to do so. You can't order someone to have a belief, an internal connection, an emotional connection to God. And a religious person, excuse me, hold on. And a religious Jew who has stayed with his God may be forced into new and possibly revolutionary relationships with him. One possibility, however, is wholly unthinkable. A Jew may not respond to Hitler's attempt to destroy Judaism by himself cooperating in its destruction. In ancient times, the unthinkable Jewish sin was idolatry. Today, it is to respond to Hitler by doing his work. What is he talking about? If Hitler is an absolute evil, and if Judaism and God are absolute goodness, therefore, Judaism cannot accommodate absolute evil. It can't. And therefore, we are the purpose of our religion, the purpose of Judaism, which is to make a better world, to establish goodness in the world. That means we have to deny and fight Hitler in every way possible. We have to deny Hitler a posthumous victory. In ancient times, he said the Jewish sin was idolatry, because idolatry was a heartless, cruel worship that ultimately gave greatest attribute to might. Might makes right in the ancient world, right? And we believe in compassion. And therefore, to worship Avodah Zarah was to deny the very essence of a giving God. And therefore, that was the ultimate sin. He says, today, when there is no real Avodah Zarah, there is no real idol worship, the ultimate sin is to allow absolute evil to have a foothold in the world. And therefore, he says, the role of Judaism is to deny Hitler. And he says, because of that, we now have a 614th mitzvah. Where did he get that number 614? The Talmud, in the section called Makot, that deals with lashes, makes a statement that there are 613 commandments in the Bible. And there's a disagreement among scholars as to exactly what they are. Everyone agrees on the great big ones: honor your mother and father, keep the Sabbath day holy, and thou shalt not kill. Everyone agrees those are commandments. But there are certain commandments. For example, is one obligated to tithe food that's grown outside of Israel, outside of the Holy Land? There's a disagreement whether that's a commandment. But everyone agrees there are in number 613. He says now, after the Holocaust, argues Fackenheim, there's 614. And what is the 614th mitzvah? The Jews are forbidden to hand Hitler a posthumous victory. What are the details of this mitzvah, this commandment? A, they are commanded to survive as Jews, lest the Jewish people perish. Now, he does not define what that means to survive as a Jew. So we can understand it in the most universal way and say, if someone identifies themselves as a Jew, if someone comes to them with a gun and says, are you a Jew? If he says, yes, I am a Jew, so he's fulfilled this requirement. He survives as a Jew. He lives as a Jew. Why? Because if we give up our Judaism for convenience, if we give up our Judaism because of the hostile nature that we might find in the world today, if we give up our Judaism because it seems that throughout history, there's been some people in the world who hate Jews, and if that makes us uncomfortable, and then we give up there will be no more Jewish people, and we will have given Hitler an ultimate victory. Number two, they're commanded to remember the victims of Auschwitz, lest their memory perish. Because the Jews of the Holocaust were killed for no reason other than being Jewish. There was no offense. There was no political disagreement. Jews were simply destroyed, massacred, because they were Jews. Therefore, the antithesis to that, the way in which that is fought, is we cannot let them die for no reason. And we have to remember them. And we have to cherish that memory. And we have to live a life, if you will, that not only serves our interests, but also represents their interests as Jews. If you will, we now have a double meaning to our lives. We have to survive as Jews ourselves, and we have to make sure that all those in the Holocaust who were destroyed simply because they were Jews have a memory and therefore a type of survival. Number 3, they are forbidden to despair of man and his world and to escape into either cynicism or otherworldliness, lest they cooperate in delivering the world over to the forces of Auschwitz. Now, this is a little more detailed. If you would come to a seminar in Yad Vashem and study in depth the Holocaust, one of the ideas that you would be exposed to is that the goal of the Nazis were not simply to kill Jews, but the goal of the Nazis were to deprive Jews of their humanity, of their link to being human beings. If Judaism preaches that the greatest and strongest of men must be compassionate to those who are weaker than them, the Nazis, they believe that the weak should perish and only the strong should survive. So therefore, they created these camps. They created a civilization that was cynical and denied the very essence of the Judeo-Christian life, the very essence of compassion and understanding and acceptance of the other. Therefore, it would be easy, or it could be that we might be cynical and we might say, what kind of world is this? Look, we represented good, and look what Hitler, who denied goodness in the world, well, look what he was able to accomplish. Look at what he did. And we're not allowed, he says, you can't become cynical like that. You can't assume that good can be vanquished by evil. And he says not only that, but we're not allowed to separate ourselves from the world. We can't become aesthetics and go on a mountain and deny our relationship with mankind, because to have a relationship with mankind is too painful, because man is in his essence evil. He says you can't do it. We're forbidden to despair of man and his world. The world and man is fundamentally good, because that idea that people can be fundamentally good is the antithesis of the cynicism and the attempt of Nazism to deprive man, and particularly Jews, of their humanity, because that will be cooperating. If we do that, we'll be cooperating with the forces of Auschwitz. And lastly, he says, we are forbidden to despair of the God of Israel, lest Judaism perish. That's what makes this a theological argument. What exactly does that mean? It means that part of the definition of Judaism is the belief in one God. It's what Judaism is about. We were established by Abraham, who brought monotheism to the world. And it is intensely mixed in to the definition of Judaism. Even if a Jew were to become an atheist, he's arguing with the concept of God. And that's the type of recognition. And therefore, one must allow that place that God holds in Judaism to survive. Because if we don't, we'll have destroyed Judaism, and what will remain might be similar, but it will not be Judaism according to Fackenheim. And that will be handing Hitler a posthumous victory. So Fackenheim argues that the Holocaust imposes upon Jews today a responsibility to maintain Judaism in a recognizable way, so that all the victims of the Holocaust, the 6 million, will not be forgotten, and the reason that they were killed will survive, thus giving them a type of survival. Review. Rubinstein, the relationship with God is over. Fackenheim, the 614th commandment. We are now imbued with a new mission. Our third philosopher, Michael Wyschogrod. Michael Wyschogrod was born in Berlin, Germany, September 28th, 1928. As a child, Wyschogrod spent summers in Budapest, visiting his maternal grandparents. The family fled Nazi Germany and arrived in the United States on July 3rd, 1939, when Wyschogrod was 10 years old. He attended the Orthodox Adas Yisrael school in Berlin, and then after immigrating to New York City in 1939, he went to a very religious school called Yeshiva, which is the name of a Jewish seminary or religious school, Torah Vidas, from which he graduated in 1945. It was in Torah Vidas that Wyschogrod studied under Rabbi Shlomo Hyman, from whom he learned that part of the Torah cannot be written down, but must be transmitted only by a person whose everyday conduct exemplifies it. He learned that the tradition of Judaism is ultimately maintained and passed down by those who observe Jewish tradition. That part of the, and he subsequently studied Talmud with Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik at Yeshiva University from 1946 to 52. He studied philosophy at City College and Columbia University, where he earned his PhD in 1953. He wrote a dissertation, which was later published under the title Kierkegaard and Heidegger, The Ontology of Existence. It's interesting to note, if we had much more time, we could discuss the fact that he was a scholar, and he studied Heidegger, who was considered a proponent of Nazi philosophy, or at least he accommodated it. It's an interesting subject for a different class. The ontology of existence. What did Wyschogrod write? He wrote the following. A faith founded, or Judaism, is founded on God's eternal love of Israel, and it emphasizes instead our experience of God's salvation and redemption, which we once experienced, and Judaism declares we will experience again. God chose the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. God chose the Jewish people because of Abraham's commitment to monotheism. God saved the Jewish people from Egypt. The story of the Jewish people in the Bible is a story of a people that have been constantly saved and redeemed by God. And we believe, the Jewish people believe, that in the future the Messiah will come and once again redeem the Jewish people. Israel's faith has always centered around the saving acts of God, the election, the choosing of the Jewish people, the Exodus, the escape of slavery in Egypt, the temple, the building of Israel, and the creation of a place where Jewish worship and relationship to God was the center. It was the center of Israel life, and ultimately believed the Messiah. However more prevalent destruction was in the history of Israel, acts of destruction were enshrined in minor fast days, while those of redemption became the joyous proclamations of the Passover and Tabernacles, of Hanukkah and Purim. Even though there's been much tragedy in Jewish history, those tragedies are not the making of the Jewish life cycle. We do not spend all day, every day of the year remembering the tragedies that befell the Jewish people. Instead, we celebrate the great holidays that speak of God's redeeming relationship with us, right? Passover, when God took us out of Egypt. Tabernacles, when he protected us as we wandered 40 years in the desert. And he had a cloud over us and under us, and he protected us from the elements. And Hanukkah, the story that we light the menorah of how the ancient Greeks attempted to destroy the Jewish people and God saved us, both with the weak being able to conquer the mighty armies. The weak Jewish armies conquered the mighty armies, and by the miracle of the oil that lasted for 8 days. And of course, Purim, when the ancient Persians tried to wipe out the Jewish people. God of Israel is a redeeming God, says Wyschogrod. This is the only message we are authorized to proclaim, however much it may not seem so to the eyes of non-belief. Should the Holocaust cease to be peripheral to the faith of Israel, should it enter the Holy of Holies and become the dominant voice that Israel hears, it could not but be a demonic voice that it would be hearing. What does he mean? He says that if Judaism becomes a lament of the Holocaust, if we view the Holocaust as Rubinstein did, that there can be no relationship anymore because the evil is too great. It permeates everything. The relationship is over. He says that's a demonic voice because the story is not the Holocaust. The story is not that 6 million people were killed according to Wyschogrod. According to Wyschogrod, the story is that I'm speaking to you today, that there are millions of Jewish people once again in the world, that we have a country of our own, that we live in freedom to observe our relationship with God. And Hitler, with all of his might and with all of his cunning and with all of the strength that he had as the most powerful nation in the world, was unable to vanquish the Jewish people who had nothing. How were we saved? Asked Wyschogrod. We were saved because God redeemed us. And that's the message of the Holocaust. There is no salvation to be extracted from the Holocaust. No faltering Judaism can be revived by it. He's now taking a punch at Fackenheim. He says, this is not about reviving Judaism and creating a new reason to be Jewish. That's not what it is. Judaism is the traditional Judaism, he says. He was an Orthodox rabbi. And he says, rather, we can celebrate that once again, under the most horrific circumstances, God saved us. God redeemed us. No new vision for the continuation of the Jewish people can be found in it. If there is hope after the Holocaust, it is because to those who believe, the voices of the prophets speak more loudly than did Hitler, and because the divine promise sweeps over the crematoria and silences the voice of Auschwitz. You know, they tell stories, we read. One of the great things of working in Yad Vashem is our library and our artifacts and our ability to not only tell the story of the Holocaust, but to allow the people, the victims, in whatever form, the survivors and those who didn't survive, we use their words. But not only the victims, we also hear from the perpetrators, the Nazis themselves. And there's many times where we hear a Nazi and we hear people quoting Nazis right before they commit the most atrocious crimes, challenging the Jew. Where's your God now, Jew? Where's your God now, chosen people? So Wyschogrod will say, he's here. Where is the Nazi regime now? We survived. They were vanquished. And not only them, but before them, the Greeks and the Romans and the Inquisition and throughout history, all those who have tried to destroy the Jewish people, even if it seems as if they're meeting with some kind of success, at the end of the day, God redeems his people. And that's the message that Wyschogrod says we can derive from the Holocaust. The relationship with God is as strong as ever because God once again has proven his love to us by redeeming us from the most awful of circumstances. Rubinstein, the relationship between God is over. Fackenheim, we now have a new mandate in Judaism to remember the Holocaust and to deny Hitler a posthumous victory. And now Wyschogrod, that we celebrate the fact that we are still here, that God has redeemed us, and we don't mourn, even though the Holocaust was so very terrible. Our fourth philosopher, Eliezer Berkovitz, was an Orthodox rabbi, theologian, and educator. Berkovitz received his smicha, his rabbinical ordination, under Rabbi Akiva Glasner, son of Rabbi Moshe Shmuel Glasner, author of Dor Revi, a very famous book of rabbinical scholarship. He later studied at the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin as a disciple of Rabbi Yechiel Weinberg, a great master of Jewish law. Yechiel Weinberg was probably the Western European rabbi that shepherded the Western European Jews through the difficulties of the Holocaust, certainly at the beginning in the late 30s, early, mid, and late 30s, and even the early 40s. Yechiel Weinberg was one of the great Jewish religious Orthodox leaders, and he was also a teacher at this rabbinical seminary in Berlin called Hildesheimer, right? And he received a PhD in philosophy from the University of Berlin. He served in the rabbinate in Berlin. He was in Berlin at the rise of Nazism when Hitler came to power through Kristallnacht, and then he went to Leeds, England, and ultimately, and then to Sydney, Australia, and then to Boston. In 1948, he left Boston, and he became the chairman of the Department of Jewish Philosophy at the Hebrew Theological College in Skokie, Illinois, right outside of Chicago. And that institution is still there today. And at age 67, he and his family immigrated to Israel in 1976, where he taught and lectured until his death in 1992. Berkovitz wrote 19 books in English, Hebrew, and German, and lectured extensively in those languages. His writings deal with basic issues of faith and spirituality and law and the creative dialogue between religion and modernity, with an emphasis on halacha, Jewish law in the state of Israel, and Jewish law relating to marriage and women. His thought is in essence a philosophy of morality and history for contemporary society. Now, I don't want you to get scared. There's a lot of words on this page, but you'll see they fit together in a traditional ontological argument. In a sense, God can be neither good nor bad. In terms of his own nature, he is incapable of evil. Remember, we define God as being beneficent, absolutely good. God cannot be evil. It's an ontological argument. The definition of God is that he cannot be evil. God being incapable of the unethical is not an ethical being. God doesn't choose to be ethical, which is what an ethical being does. God is ethical by definition. Goodness for him is neither an ideal nor a value. Its existence, it is absolutely realized in his being. God is good because God's definition is good. God's definition is kindness. God's definition is ethics, justice, love, peace, mercy are ideals for man only. They are values that may be realized by man alone. To be an ethical being is to strive and achieve ethical behavior. To be kind is to strive to act kindly. To be good is to strive to be good. God does not strive to be good or ethical. God is. And therefore, God is perfection. Yet, because of God's very perfection, he's lacking, as it were, one type of value, the one which is the result of striving for value. God does not have, the one thing God doesn't have is the ability to accomplish and turn himself into an ethical being. He is. He doesn't acquire. He doesn't achieve. He is all light, right, Berkovitz? And on just that account, he's lacking the light that comes out of the darkness. One might also say that with man, the good is axiology. With God, it's ontology. With man, it's something you can acquire and achieve. But with God, it is part and parcel of his definition, his very definition. Man alone can strive and struggle for the good. God is good. Man alone can create value. Now he continues. But if man alone is the creator of values, one who strives for the realization of ideals, then he must have freedom of choice and freedom of decision. And his freedom must be respected by God himself. God cannot, as a rule, intervene whenever man's use of freedom displeases him. If he did so, the possibility for good also disappears. What is he saying? He's saying good means you choose good. In order to choose good, you have to have the option of choosing bad. In order to be righteous, you have to have the option of being evil. Only when you have the option of being cruel can you achieve kindness. Only when you have the option of being unethical can you achieve the ethical. So he says that God has to respect that. God created man with a mission to become good. And in order for man to be able to accomplish that mission, he has to have the choice of being bad. If he didn't do that, if God, every time I did a sin, if God zapped me so that I would not be able to do a sin, so then there would be no possibility of me being good because I have no choice. Goodness, part of goodness, is the act of choosing to be good. Man can be frightened. God can tell me about his punishments, but he cannot be bludgeoned into goodness. You can't force, not that you can't, God could, but to do so would to destroy the very world that God created. It would become a world lacking choice. If God did not respect man's freedom to choose his course in personal responsibility, not only would the moral good and evil be abolished from the earth, but man himself would go with them. For freedom and responsibility are the very essence of man. Without them, man is not human. If there is to be man, he must be allowed to make his choices in freedom. And if he has such freedom, he will use it. And using it, he will often use it wrongly. He will decide the wrong alternative. And as he does so, there will be suffering for the innocent. I ask you to look at this horrible picture on the side of your screen. Here you have a difficult circumstance. This Nazi chose to do what he's doing. And he had to have the freedom. He could have chose better. He could have said, this is evil, and I'm not going to do it. I refuse. But he chose evil. And by choosing evil, this woman and her child suffer. One could call that, Berkovitz writes, the divine dilemma that God's erech apayim, he uses a Hebrew term. One of the characteristics of God is that he is slow to anger. What does that mean? He gives man the opportunity to repent. He patiently waits. He has his patiently waiting countenance to some is of necessity identical to his hesder panim, his heightening of the countenance to others. He says, here's the dilemma. If man sins, man has to have the opportunity to repent. And that takes time. Man has to realize his sin. He has to have remorse for his sin. He has to promise not to sin again. And then he has to make amends. That takes time. And therefore, God is slow to anger, the Bible tells us. God is slow to anger, and because it's a kindness. He gives the sinner the opportunity to repent. And there's another state of affairs, the Bible tells us, that there will be times when it seems that God turns his face. He hides from us. He no longer stands up to save us. For this woman in the picture, huddling and caring for her child only moments before her death, it would seem that God is turning his face. And Berkovitz says there's a problem, there's a dilemma, a conundrum. In order for this Nazi to have the opportunity to repent and leave his evil ways, it's going to seem to this woman that God has turned his face on her. However, the dilemma does find a resolution in history. If man is to be, Berkovitz writes, God himself must respect his freedom of decision. And if man is to act on his own responsibility without being continually overawed by divine supremacy, God must absent himself from history. Man is to have freedom of choice, God must let, Berkovitz says, if man is to act completely on his own responsibility without being continually, God has to be absent. But man left to his freedom, his performance in history gives little reassurance that he can survive in freedom. He says man has a tendency throughout history to abuse freedom. We have the freedom to discover, to learn, to understand science. And sometimes we use that freedom not to seek out drugs for diseases, but to make weapons of war. Man could live in harmony with his brother, but so often we choose to hate, to kill. That's not so reassuring. So Berkovitz writes, God took a risk with man, and he cannot. Berkovitz is pointing his finger at God Almighty. And he says, you cannot abandon us because you know that we might make the wrong decision and destroy everything. God cannot divest himself of responsibility of man. If man is not to perish at the hand of man, if the ultimate destiny of man is not to be left to the chance that man will never make the fatal decision, God must remain present. In other words, man is given freedom of choice, but only to a limit. In other words, at the point that man will simply destroy everything, God intervenes. The God of history must be absent. He must give us freedom of choice, even if that appears to mean that he's denying the innocent protection and he's allowing them to be persecuted. He has to be, and present at the same time. He has to make us win, because if the Nazis would have won, the world would be destroyed. He hides his presence, and he is present without being indubitably manifest. He is absent without being hopelessly inaccessible. Thus, many find him even in his absence, and many miss him even in his presence. Because the necessity of his absence, there is the hiding of the face and suffering of the innocent. Because of the necessity of his presence, evil will not ultimately triumph. Because of it, there is hope for man. God will save us, but not immediately, eventually. And in the immediate, God gives us the freedom of choice, the freedom to make mistakes. There's a interesting true story that was told to me by the protagonist in it. And I think it sort of illustrates this. The United States Army liberated the Mauthausen concentration camp, General Patton's army. And with General Patton's army was an American, a European, but an Orthodox rabbi from Cincinnati named Eliezer Silver. And when they got into Mauthausen, of course, it was beyond horror. We can't imagine what it was. The bodies and the stench and the starvation it was beyond comprehension. And the survivors of this horrible experience began to congregate amongst their own. In one corner there was survivors from Poland, and they were waving a version of the Polish flag, and the Poles would go there, and there was a corner for the Germans and a corner for the Austrians and a corner for the Hungarians. Everybody but the Jews, so the Jews made their own. And they sat in one corner and they waved a makeshift Israeli flag. And slowly but surely the Jews gathered in this corner. And eventually Rabbi Silver found this group of people. And he said to them, you survived. You made it. You survived. Through you will come the future of the people. He said, let us pray the afternoon service. Jews pray 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. And he said to these survivors, he said, let us thank God that we've survived. And in fact, in a remarkable show of faith, these people got up and began to pray a very short and brief afternoon service. Everyone, that is, except for one fellow. One fellow, with the last of his strength, went back into his barracks and refused to participate. After the service, Eliezer Berkovitz went into the barracks and said to him, my friend, how come you survived? Why didn't you join the rest? And he says, Rabbi, I'm going to tell you the truth. I can't believe in God. So the rabbi, of course, listened. He says, I'm going to tell you why. In my bunk, in this concentration camp, every day we would go out and be worked to death. And the only thing, the thin thread that stood between a man and his ultimate demise was the very little bit of bread that the Nazis threw at us every morning that we had to make last. If someone lost their bread or they didn't have it and we could count on them being dead the next morning. He said, there was a man in my barracks who had a prayer book, and he would allow people to use the prayer book in exchange for their ration of bread. And people would wait in line, sometimes for hours, and exchange their last bit of bread for the opportunity to use this prayer book. And we would often, if not most of the time, find these people dead. He said, I want no part of a relationship with a God and a religion that would allow such a thing to happen. Well, Eliezer Berkovitz was a very smart man. And he listened and he said, you are right. I also want nothing to do with a relationship. I want nothing to do with a religion that could allow such a thing to happen. Any religion that could tolerate such evil of a man who would sell his prayer book for a piece of bread, I want nothing to do with either. He said, but I would like to be part of a religion whose adherents are so dedicated and devoted that they would be willing to wait in line in starving condition and give their last morsel of bread in order to talk to their God. I think that's a little bit what Berkovitz is speaking about. Berkovitz is telling us that the relationship with God is complex. And while to some it might seem as if God has abandoned us and evil permeates everything, and to others, to evil people, God seems to give the time to be more evil when in fact he's giving them the time to repent. But at the end of the day, like Wyschogrod, Berkovitz says, that God redeems us, and that is the ultimate comfort, if that's called a comfort, that we can have from the Holocaust, that our relationship with God is as it always is, on God's terms. Review. Rubinstein, the relationship with God is over. Fackenheim, Judaism has a mandate to deprive Hitler of his posthumous victory. Wyschogrod, God is a redeeming God. And just as God has redeemed us throughout history, in every story in the Bible, so too, God redeemed us after the Holocaust. And Berkovitz, that we don't fully understand, and that sometimes God seems distant from us. And sometimes God seems to be favoring the evil. But rest assured that the fact that the world still exists tells us that ultimately God will intervene for the good. The last philosopher that we're going to see is Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik was known as the Rav. He was a major Orthodox thinker and philosopher. He was a Talmudist and a modern Jewish thinker. Born in Brisk, Lithuania, he was the scion of the great Lithuanian Jewish Soloveitchik rabbinic dynasty. He was educated in the traditional manner at a elementary school, Jewish elementary school, and by private tutors as his parents realized his great mental powers. In 1926, he went to Berlin and he entered the Friedrich Wilhelm Institute, where he wrote his PhD thesis on the epistemology and metaphysics of the German philosopher Hermann Cohen. Both of them developed a system of thought that bridged the Eastern European way of traditional scholarship with the new forces of modernity in the Western world. In 1932, he immigrated to the United States and settled in Boston. While there, he established the Maimonides Day School in 1937, which was one of the first Orthodox co-ed day schools in America. In 1941, he succeeded his father, who had come to America earlier, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, and he became head of the Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Theological Seminary at Yeshiva University, which is still in existence today. The Rav Soloveitchik, ordained close to 2,000 rabbis, which is perhaps maybe the most of any man in Jewish history in the course of almost half a century. He serves as an advisor, guide, mentor, and role model for tens of thousands of Jews, both as a Talmud scholar and as a religious leader. He is regarded as the seminal figure by modern Orthodoxy. The Rav writes, Judaism, with its realistic approach to man and his place in the world, understood that evil,
the Holocaust, and
cannot be blurred or camouflaged. Judaism, with its realistic approach to man and his place in the world, understood that evil cannot be blurred or camouflaged, and that any attempt to downplay the extent of the contradiction and fragmentation to be found in reality will neither endow man with tranquility nor enable him to grasp the existential mystery. He's arguing with Wyschogrod. He says, don't say that everything and all is going to turn out good, so all that ends well is well. That's not true, he says. There is evil in the world. There is pain in the world. Evil is an undeniable fact. There is evil. There is suffering. There are hellish torments in the world. Whoever wishes to delude himself by diverting his attention from the deep fissure in reality, by romanticizing human existence, is naught but a fool and a fantast. He says, you've got to see the world for what it is. And there is evil. There are terrible things in the world. And then he quotes a phrase, and again, he uses a Hebrew phrase, so I will translate. He says, against your will you are born, and against your will you die. That's called gurul, chance. We didn't ask to be born, and we do not choose our day of death. It's just the cards were dealt, gurul. He says, but we live of our own free will. That's you. The Rav says, Rav Soloveitchik says, we didn't ask, no one asked to be poor, or some people are born rich, some are born poor, some are tall, some are short, some have athletic ability, some have none, some have great wisdom, some are challenged, right? No, that's the cards you're dealt. He says that's not the story of life. The story of life is not the cards you're dealt. The story of life is how do you play the hand you're dealt. We've all seen the pictures of the fellow who was born without legs or had an accident and had his legs amputated and refuses to give up and ultimately masters prosthetic limbs and runs in the Olympics. He says the challenge of life is not to be dealt a good hand. That's nothing. We have no choice. The challenge is how do you play the hand? No one asked to be in Auschwitz. No one asked to suffer through the Holocaust. But he says that's not our choice. It's none of our business. We don't understand how these things happen. It's not our choice. Our choice is one thing and one thing only. How shall we act when we find ourselves in a situation that's not our choice? The Jewish approach is to transition from a fated life to a destined life. In our fated life, evil happens to us. We suffer. We have no control. In a life of destiny, we do not focus on the tragedy that befalls us. What must the sufferer do so that he may live through his suffering? Is the Jewish legal question the man of destiny asks. What obligation does suffering impose on me? He says, I'm suffering. Now what? How shall I act? How shall I act to my fellow man? Shall I hold fast to my beliefs, to my convictions, or will I allow the suffering to define me? We do not inquire, he says, about the hidden ways of the Almighty, but rather about the path wherein man shall walk when suffering strikes. We ask neither about the cause of evil, nor about its purpose, but rather about how might it be mended and elevated. How shall a person act in a time of trouble? What ought a man do so that he does not perish in his afflictions? He says evil always has and always will exist. And the challenge is, how shall we respond to it? What will we do to master it? Because while fate is not in our hands, destiny most assuredly is. Quick review. Rubinstein, the relationship with God is over. Fackenheim, we must deny Hitler a posthumous victory. Wyschogrod, God is a redeeming God. Berkovitz, God ultimately will redeem us even though we might suffer in the short term. And Soloveitchik, that ultimately our relationship by God is not defined by the circumstance in which we find ourselves, but rather by the way we live in even the most difficult of circumstances.